What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Hi listeners, host Grace Anna here. Today I am thrilled to share a special episode from our ArtMuse ArtTalks series, in which I am joined by the author Mark Braude, who wrote Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris, a gorgeously written biography on the fabulous Kiki de Montparnasse. Throughout the course of the interview, I ask Mark about Kiki's life, what inspired him to write his biography on her, her relationship with Man Ray, Kiki's success as an artist across many mediums, and finally, the importance of honoring Kiki's legacy today. If you have not yet listened to ArtMuse's two-part episode on Kiki de Montparnasse, which deep dives into Kiki's life, I encourage you to listen as an accompanying episode to this interview. You can find ArtMuse's episode on Kiki de Montparnasse by searching for ArtMuse on all streaming platforms, as well as on our website, www.artmusepodcast.com. For those who haven't yet listened to our episode on Kiki de Montparnasse, Kiki was an artist model, performer, painter, actress, and memoirist, active in Paris during the Roaring Twenties. Over her lifetime, Kiki became one of the most prolific art models in the history of Western art, modeling for many of the best painters of her day, as well as the photographer Man Ray, with whom she shared an 8-year-long relationship. Over the course of their affair, Man Ray took hundreds of photos of Kiki. Kiki played an integral role in the creation of each of these works, co-collaborating on them with Man Ray, despite receiving no official credit. But Kiki was far more than just Man Ray's muse. She was also an artist in her own right, and her creativity took many forms. Kiki was an accomplished painter, cabaret performer, and published her own autobiography when she was only 28 years old. Though Kiki de Montparnasse fell into relative obscurity after her death, she deserves to be remembered as the visionary and independent woman she was. A woman who inspired masterpieces by the greatest artists of her day, who painted with unrestrained expression and sang with bravado, whose memoir gained international recognition, and whose free spirit came to symbolize an entire era of European history. Mark Braude's wonderful biography on Kiki is an important contributor to honoring Kiki's legacy and getting her story out into the world. Mark Braude is the author of 3 nonfiction books, Kiki Man Ray being his third. He has been a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar, a visiting fellow at the American Library in Paris, and a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. He is currently based in Vancouver, Canada, where he lives with his family. So without further ado, let's dive into my conversation with the author, Mark Braude. Hi, listeners. Host Grace Anna here. Today, I am joined by author Mark Braude to discuss his wonderful biography, Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris, which tells the life story of the fabulous Kiki de Montparnasse. For any new listeners, if you have not yet listened to ArtMuse's two-part episode on Kiki de Montparnasse, which not only deep dives into her life, but quotes Mark's eloquent writing throughout, both part 1 and part 2, then I encourage you to take a listen as an accompanying episode to this interview. Mark, thank you so much for being with me here today. I have read and very much loved Kiki Man Ray, and I relied on it heavily in my research. But for those listening who have not yet read your book, could you introduce us to Kiki Man Ray and tell us a little bit about who Kiki de Montparnasse was?
Sure, thank you. And thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it. I guess the best way to do that would be to start with the origin of the whole book, which is really the story of this one photograph, is really how I got into the whole thing, which was, if I describe it, might ring some bells. It's the picture of a woman whose nude torso, the back, is marked up with the F-holes of a violin so that she looks like an instrument, and her head is turned to profile and she has a kind of a mischievous smile. The title is Le Violon d'Ingres, Ingres' violin. It was made in 1924 and credited to Man Ray. And say about 9-10 years ago, I was teaching a series of courses in art history and in the history of Paris. And I would use that picture when I was talking about the 20s, which was always my favorite era. Americans in Paris, surrealism, all that kind of stuff. And I would use it to talk about surrealism. I would use it to talk about Man Ray. And about the woman in the picture, I would say her name was Kiki de Montparnasse, and she was known as the top artist model in Paris in the 20s and was the lover of Man Ray when this image was made. And that's all I said really in these classes because that's all I knew. And it just sort of got to bothering me after a few iterations of giving that lecture, like, well, I don't know more about her. And just for the sake of a better lecture, for the sake of my own kind of education, I wanted to dig in a little. And so I just tried to find as much as I could about Kiki de Montparnasse. And as soon as I did, I mean, I'm talking like maybe 2 or 3 days of digging, I was like, this is a book. This life is so fascinating. And the story I had, and that most people had, was completely backwards. And by which I mean, really, when that picture was made, the few people who saw it in Paris in the 20s, in 24 specifically, among the surrealists, in this little magazine where it was originally printed, would have said, well, that's our iconic Kiki de Montparnasse, the artist that we know well. And she's been caught on film by her boyfriend, this guy, Man Ray, this American who's just starting out here in Paris. And so, I wanted to get to the bottom of like, well, why had that story kind of been told backwards and who she was. With Kiki, turned out, yes, she was indeed this amazing model who not everyone, but, the major artists of that era and in that little space of Montparnasse, names that might not be household names these days, but were big at the time. Chaim Soutine, Sugihara Fujita, possibly Modigliani, she might have posed for. They all wanted to capture her in their various media. And she had this really unique look and this really unique energy. I guess the closest thing you could compare it to was like the early punks in the 70s in the Lower East Side and in London. She was really out of her era in a sense. She had the bob before anybody. And so that is true. She was this model, right? But what I got to learning, which was far more interesting to me, was that she was also an artist in many different forms, most notably as a cabaret singer. In the mid-20s, she starts to sing this little club called The Jockey in Montparnasse and really becomes this local celebrity through her performances, and also a painter, an illustrator. We can get into each of these as we go, and an actress, an actor, and finally a writer, which was really when I knew this would be a book, is that I found that she was a writer and a memoirist, and everybody in this era really wrote about it, but she wrote about it quite beautifully. And so I had her view, I had Man Ray's view, and I had this world. And so that's sort of where the book comes from.
Lovely introduction. I think you make such an important point off the bat, which is, we all know Man Ray now, Of course, we know Modigliani, who we think he painted Kiki. There is a portrait that looks very much like Kiki, although it hasn't been confirmed with certainty. But that Kiki actually was more famous than Man Ray at the time of them working together. She was, like you said, a performer. She was a painter who had sold out exhibitions. She was an actress, an extra in a few films, as well as in Man Ray's film, and another film called Ballet Mécanique, which came out around that time. So she was this multifaceted, creative, and spirited woman who was actually more well-known than Man Ray at the time and really should be credited for jumpstarting his career. So I think you make a very, very good point. And I think that anecdote of you, like most people, have seen these photographs of Kiki, perhaps these portraits of Kiki, but history has sort of overlooked her importance as an individual and as a creative and as an artist in her own right. Before we dive into her relationship with Man Ray, I really loved this quote from your book, and it poses some questions that I hope you can answer, but it sort of gets at the miraculousness of Kiki's story, that this girl born poor in the countryside of France became to really embody and represent an entire era of European history. And so I just think it's so beautifully written. I'm going to read this quote and have you answer your own questions for us today. So your quote reads, "How did it happen that this young woman, born poor, obscure, and illegitimate, who in her brief life barely made enough to eat, by singing old songs for tips, posing for the art of others, selling sketches to fellow drinkers spied from her bar stool. How did it happen that this young woman should be the one to capture the spirit of her age like no one else, and by doing nothing more than making a performance of herself?" So if you could answer some of those questions, how did Kiki de Montparnasse become Kiki de Montparnasse?
That's a great that's a great way of posing the question, turning it on me, because now I'm like, oh gosh, that is a tough question to answer in a sense, and that's the project of the book, of course. The brief way of getting into that, because there's a lot there, is to talk about, yes, so her background is modest. She was born in a little village called Châtillon-sur-Seine. It's 1901, and at that point, to be born that far from Paris, even if it's a few hundred miles, is like a whole other world. I mean, it's really like, this is a different universe with its own customs. People, when she got to Paris, were really struck by her accent, the way she rolled her R's. Her name, by the way, was Alice Prin. That's her birth name. And yes, didn't know her father. Her mother was a teenager when she had her and was sent to Paris to sort of escape the local shame in the village. And then Kiki was raised by a grandmother and went to rejoin her and worked a series of kind of odd jobs, menial labor as a teenager, really quite young, and gets to Montparnasse. And I think that question of, well, how did she do it? What is it about her that made her sort of embody this spirit of the age is multifaceted. One is that she sort of invented herself, right? So she takes the name Kiki, which is sort of just a nickname. Eventually it becomes Kiki de Montparnasse, this idea of that she's almost royalty, but also Kiki of Montparnasse. This is the place that made her. This is her little duchy, if you will, her territory. And she invents this character, which she does on stage at first, and then it becomes something that people want to capture on screen. Also through her posing, also through interviews. She was a great kind of a journalist's dream. She spoke in headlines. She really got, great quotable quotes. And through her writing and through her painting, she has this self-invented character of Kiki de Montparnasse, who's both a kind of a country bumpkin. She plays up the kind of like farm girl side of her upbringing and uses these really like outdated old jokes and aphorisms. And then at the same time, she's this very like hypersexual, hyperconfident Parisian sophisticate, which is in truth, she was quite shy and almost quite conservative in her way. But on stage, she's just really fierce, and she's got these two things playing at once. And she sings these old folk songs, right? But she reinvents them. She just through her mannerisms, her motions, kind of ironic winks and gestures, vamps it up, I guess, is the way to say it. And people really can't get enough of it among the avant-garde of Paris, because everyone's trying to do all this new stuff, hyper modern. And she's this sort of throwback, but also very anarchic and a very avant-garde in her own right. And she's seeing what's going around too with all the surrealists and stuff, and channeling all that onto stage. And I think in that way, that idea of having this character that you become, and then whose story you tell through various means, on stage, on film, in your paintings, because the paintings are about her childhood, the paintings are about her village, and about her friends around her. And then in her writing, where she kind of knows everyone, and she's talking about all the people she knows and herself. People, when they reviewed the book, often made the jump to like, this is a reality star, but a century ago. And in a sense, that's, somewhat clumsy, but I kind of also make the same point in implicit ways. I think it's not totally wrong, is that she's telling this saga of herself that you follow for its twists and turns. And it's supposed to be real. It's like the authentic Kiki, but of course it's also a performance, but then she becomes the performance. So that's also kind of its own authenticity. She becomes this character of Kiki de Montparnasse. She can't escape it. And so where I think she sort of captures the spirit of the 20s is she gets at this freewheeling, right? All the cliches we know about the roaring 20s. She's fun. It's all kind of exciting and new. And at the same time, there is this pain in the background, right? Everyone's recovering from trauma of war, the trauma of the flu, which killed more people than the war. And Kiki's own trauma as growing up, I think, informs her quest to sort of live really as freely as she can. She lived like she was like on fire in a sense. She's really, really going for it. And that, I think captures this spirit. And then you talk about, and this is a long answer, but I'll wrap up soon, which is this idea of fame, right? And I was just thinking back, as you said that too, there's this like Smith's lyric, fame, fickle fame. It will play hideous tricks with your brain. And it's this weird thing of like how fickle fame can be. She was famous among her group at that time, but what did it even mean? This was just like a few hundred people. And she didn't really leave much of a body of work. So much of it was in the moment, was you had to be there in this little theater, in this little nightclub to see her sing. Or, there's a handful of paintings, or there's the book, but there's not much more. So it's kind of like, that I think has a lot to do with this. There's an effervescence to her that I think also is fitting with this time.
Thank you for that. To get on that last point, I have another beautiful quote from your book that just talks about how hard it is today to have these tangible traces of her, because her art was so of the moment. And you say, Kiki's best work was her most ephemeral, a perfectly timed pause that makes everyone in a nightclub go still, isn't something you could trademark or bottle. You can't sell a dance at auction. You can't sell a pose. And it's really true that a lot of her impact was these things you had to experience in the moment at that time. And those people are so lucky to have experienced her. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Could you describe, because I think it's really important to understand Kiki, is to also understand this world of Montparnasse. So can you bring us in this world and paint a picture of what Montparnasse was like as Kiki was entering it in the early 1920s?
Sure. So, and it might in the end tie back to that quote. So, Montparnasse is this place that has been really well documented, Paris in the 20s. I love it. It's feels glamorous, and there's all these, there's Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and all that. What I liked about Kiki's story was that we're now getting at the French influence in this place. To me, as a North American, the story had come to me largely as Americans in Paris and some Canadians and the Brits. And, you forget, in a sense, that the reason they're there is because it's France, and that's because of the French, right? Paris was the most welcoming place on earth in the 20s due to needing to rebuild after the war, and they welcomed more immigrants than any other place, which is not to say it was without xenophobia and racism and all the rest, but I would argue that was the most cosmopolitan society at the time. And that it's not coincidental that this was also a place of great innovation and cultural change. And I think what that is that people are getting into this space with people who have different backgrounds, who don't look like them, who have different ideas, Eastern European Jews are coming, African Americans who have stayed after the war there. There's a big gay and lesbian population. It's really a mix of a lot of people who might feel unwelcome in their own, where they were born and have come here and start to feel a kind of a freedom that they can't at home, and which is a lovely thing. And I think it is exciting to remember, and this was something that I was kind of rediscovered as I did the research, was like, these are just people in their 20s, really. Some of them might be, past just 30 or past. They're really young, and they're just sort of making it up as they go along. All these household names, Jean Cocteau or Gertrude Stein, or, well, maybe leave Stein out of it, but Cocteau and, Hemingway and all the rest, Brancusi, people who are, cottage industries in a way, or have their names on the back of cars like Picasso. They're just like going to house parties, visiting each other's studios, hanging out at bars, cafes, and learning from one another. And nobody's thinking like, I'm going to be, 100 years from now, people are going to pay millions of dollars for my work. It's just like, how do I survive the next month? I'd like to get well known. I'd like commissions. I'd like to keep working, but let's see what we can learn from one another. So like Man Ray, for instance, is going into Brancusi's studio to learn about sculpting. And he's teaching Brancusi about photography. And they're both kind of, figuring things out. And I think that kind of mixing, that influence, and Kiki's a part of that too, it's really cool. It's just sort of like anarchy in a sense. And it just becomes the scene, right? I don't know if I sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but like I don't know that we capture that in the same way these days when there's not bodies in a room, mixing. And I've seen stuff online about the third space, which I think is really cool. Like that idea of these places that aren't work and aren't home, where we can actually like get together and socialize and exchange ideas. And I think that's lovely. I think that great things come out of those spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it was a very special time. And while it's great, there may be some aspects of that now. I think we've also come so far from that kind of environment, and Montparnasse really being this like safe space for all these different people to come and be themselves and be weird and feel accepted. It was a brewing pot for this creativity. And really, most of the biggest names in art history, from 20th century art history, came through Montparnasse. And so it is really remarkable. And then to think that she was this queen of Montparnasse and they all knew her and they all were inspired by her is so, so, so fascinating. So speaking of Americans coming to Paris and coming to Montparnasse, can you tell us a little bit about Man Ray and his relationship with Kiki, and both their romantic and working relationship, and the impact she had on his career?
Yeah, so the book is called Kiki Man Ray, and like, although Kiki kind of runs away with it, steals the show, he's a significant part of the story, and he's a significant part of her life, and vice versa. And so I wanted, as much as possible through the archives, to get at times when they were really together and bouncing off one another. And so, I was quite lucky because there's lots of letters and there's lots of memoirs from other people, and we have the photographs and all the stuff. So I was really able to get at the two of them, which I think is the heart of the story. He's an interesting guy. He was born Emanuel Radnitsky, 1890, I believe, in Philly, and then grows up in Brooklyn and changes his name to first Emmanuel Ray from Radnitsky, just a kind of American, let's shorthand. And also had, I think, some complicated relationships with his Jewish roots. And then that becomes Manny Ray and then Man Ray. And he was actually married at the time that he comes to Paris for the first time. And I think it's 21. So he's about 30, 31. He has a wife at home, but they're sort of estranged. And his idea was to go to Montparnasse to meet some of the Dadaist writers and painters and artists who he knew. So like Tristan Tzara was the big one. Duchamp, he knew well. And he was going to go to the museums and really try to learn from the masters, the so-called masters, and then go back to New York, where he was trying to make it as a painter, mostly as this kind of Cubist-inspired painter and Dadaist. But thinking of that Duchamp idea of like the idea being more important in a sense than the medium, wanted to make work that would really like bounce around in your brain after you saw it, was really his goal. And he's experimenting with photography and has his camera with him. And then he meets Kiki in the cafe, as most people met one another. And there's this spark. And they started out with the idea that she would pose for him for a photograph that he would then paint from. He said she was too beautiful to paint directly, or I think was his line. But it pretty soon becomes this romantic thing. I think they're in bed by like the second session. And then they share their lives together for 8 or 9 years in the 20s. He never goes back to America. I mean, with the exception of in the Second World War, he's really in Paris for like 50 years, gets a divorce and starts afresh in Paris. And I think that Kiki really helped him to learn his craft of photography, which he was reluctant to do in a sense. He was always saw himself as a painter and a maker of objects first and foremost. And that photography was something like he did to pay the bills because he was really good as a portraitist. And Kiki helped him, I think, with some intros. He got to know everybody. Everybody led to somebody else, and he had all these great people sit for him. And his work is great. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate Man Ray's work in various forms. It's amazing. His films are lovely. But I think what I'm trying to get at with the relationship, it was messy, volatile, sometimes violent. I think they brought out the best and the worst in one another. But that when it comes to looking at these images, these Man Ray images, especially these iconic photographs of Kiki, it helps. It helped me, and I hope it helps the reader to understand that once you see her as somebody who's really confident on stage, who really knows how to play a part, that you can now look at these pictures as little pieces of theater that have been like caught on camera. And so then it becomes, well, the question is a little bit more interesting. Is this just like a Man Ray picture of a possibly interchangeable model, which is the way that it kind of gets reported, and it's kind of the way that Christie's or Sotheby's would pitch it when they're trying to sell these things? Or is there some possibility that this is a bit more of a collaboration? Is there something a little fuzzy around the edges of who's the artist and who's the model or the muse, so to speak? And can that open up some different discussions about how we think about art in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, her name is not in the title of any of the photographs that she's in. You mentioned Violon d'Angre, and then there's Blanche et Noire is one, but of course, where she's modeled next to the African mask. And at ArtMuse, we really do try to put forth the idea that the muse is a co-collaborator. But I think there are obviously stronger examples than others. And I think Kiki de Montparnasse is a very strong example of someone who was absolutely a co-collaborator on these works. And in fact, other artists, which I found so interesting in your book, other artists did credit her as co-collaborators. Suguharu Fujita says, I think the quote is, "I could not say for sure who among the two of us was its author," about his portrait of Kiki. And then, of course, and something we can get into is Juna Barnes's study on models and how Kiki is this example of this model that's pushing the boundaries. And actually, who is more important, the model or the artist, especially if one model is inspiring multiple different artists. So yeah, I completely agree. It's such an injustice that Kiki is not credited more for not just jumpstarting Man Ray's career as a photographer, but in the actual photographs itself as a performer. If you look at the photograph of her next to the African mask, it is unbelievable what she's able to do with her face to really mimic and really look like this African mask. And, that is not to say Man Ray is not a genius behind the lens. His use of light and shadow is brilliant, but certainly they were collaborations. Do you want to speak a little bit about Juna Barnes, and maybe even to preface that as well? We talk a lot about on this show how hard it was to be an artist model. So maybe starting with how hard it was to be an artist model. We know that Kiki's own mother disowned her when she found out that Kiki was an artist model. And then how Kiki transformed being an artist model, which Juna Barnes credits her with, and how that does make her a co-collaborator on these works of art.
Yeah. And I should start by kind of apologizing, I guess, to really like preaching to the choir. Of course, you know all these things that I'm bringing up because that's like really the heart of the project, of the podcast.
We love talking about it. And I think it's so important. So
right. And it's interesting, like, listen, I have a PhD in history and visual culture. I taught this stuff at Stanford, and I was doing the exact thing that, this is the point of, like, I had the story wrong.
Yeah.
And recently, Christie sold a copy of a print of the Le Violon d'Angle, this image that we opened the discussion with. It was a record-setting sale. I think it was like 12 million something.
Wow.
When it got reported, the Wall Street Journal was the one to first report it. The headline was something like Man Ray's iconic image of a nude woman sells for 12 mil. And then paragraph 3, you get Kiki's name and it's just model.
Wow.
Or model muse. And as I said, I can't really fault the journal's reporting because it's the same story, before really digging in. I think there's countless stories like this of people who have been overlooked. But you're absolutely right that it all starts with this. Her whole story starts with the idea of what it means to be an artist model. And it's very much a commercial enterprise. There is an exchange. People came to Paris from all over because there were great schools. And then after the very stiff academic schools opened, there were then more rebellious schools and smaller schools. And so there are all these little art institutes, most of them on the left bank. And Montparnasse is a place that has this industrial working class background to it. And so there are these big industrial lots that get converted into gallery spaces, into academies. You get the cafes pop up to cater to the people who are coming from all over. And so you have this scene. And within the scene, there is artists, most of them male, not all of them, are looking for models, most of them women. And there was a sort of market where this happened at the Académie Colarossi. And most of the models were Italian because in France, it was deemed very, low class, I guess would be the word, to be an artist model. It was kind of a shameful job. And so there was this idea of the outsiders will do it, the Italians. And in Italy, there was this sculpture, very deep respect for modeling in a sense, because it had been of their own art history. Then with the war, the First World War, a lot of the Italians are deported as enemy aliens. And so the idea shifts a little bit. And Kiki walks into this world, and it's now become, by the end of the war, much less formal. It happens, this exchange of artists meeting models and models meeting artists happens at the cafes of Montparnasse. And one in particular, the Rotonde, which is still there and worth a visit. And you have to get into the back room of the Rotonde, which is where everyone hangs out. And you do that by being charming, by being beautiful, by being exciting. There's a sort of gatekeeping that happens. And Kiki at first is really a misfit among these misfits. She's unkempt. She's a bit odd. I mean, she really was out of time and place in her own way. But I think she was funny, and she would sit on the bar stool and draw people and kind of shove the picture in their face and be like, that'll be, $5 or whatever the equivalent was in francs. And people were kind of shamed into paying her for their portrait. And she would tell jokes and she had these stories. And then eventually she sort of wore the gatekeepers down and she got into the back room. And there's Modigliani and there's all the rest, and Chaim Soutine and Moïse Kisling. And it all kind of starts from there. This idea of, there's a competition in a sense of who can find the most visually exciting material, which happens to be a human being. But there, it's very much that idea of I have something. If I can be the one to paint Kiki. And then when it comes to her striking up her relationship with Man Ray, there's a jealousy there. And I think that he was adamant after a while together that she would stop posing for other people. I think both, out of sort of romantic jealousy and also very much a professional self-interest of this is my material in a sense.
Yeah, I think the mention of jealousy in their relationships is really important. Unfortunately, it seems that the jealousy went beyond her modeling for other artists. It even went as far as her own success as a painter in her own right, as a performer, as a beloved member of this community. He really seemed to struggle with her success. And this jealousy, it really seemed to be what broke their relationship in the end. Why do you think Man Ray was so threatened by Kiki's success? And I guess as a follow-up, did Man Ray ever credit Kiki as a co-collaborator as other artists did, or was part of that jealousy his inability to do so?
It's a thorny issue. I think that the sort of generous way of looking at it is that Man Ray encouraged her, appreciated her, and was really in awe of her talent. I think there is some of that. I think that he, not so much when she got onto the visual side, I think what she saw as his territory, but I think as her as a performer, I think he was genuinely trying to encourage her to do that. And then when it got too big, he was like, no, you should be at home with me. And she did really, they did fall into these very rigid roles in their relationship where she was cooking and cleaning and menu planning and entertaining guests. And he was working. And that he saw her art making as a hobby in a sense. And so there is that also that he's really, he's encouraging it, but within a certain definition of how he wants it to be. Where the jealousy comes, it's interesting. It's not just, it's a complicated kind of jealousy. And then I think his idea was in art, he was going to be free. The role of the artist, the avant-garde artist, is to be free from everything, societal norms, oppressions, family, all that stuff. But he was also really ambitious and really commercially ambitious, which is not, I'm not judging him. That's a part of life, right? And he was very commercially successful. Kiki, on the other hand, wasn't, at least from what I saw from her own writing and what people said about her, wasn't really thinking. She wanted to express herself. She had these things she wanted to get across. And she had this art inside of her, this way she wanted to communicate. She wanted to tell the truth about herself. She wanted to tell lies about herself. She wanted to entertain. She wanted to connect. She wanted to be something that she couldn't be in her daily life. Was she trying to make an intellectual argument about the history of art and her place within it and posterity and stuff like that? I don't have records of that. I think she was much more of the moment, which is not to say she was dumb in any way. That's just her version of making art was much more about the pleasure of it, I think. And her approach to money was, she has this quote, all I need is an onion, a piece of bread, a glass of wine. I can usually find somebody to get that for me, and I'm fine. And she talked the talk and she walked the walk. That's how she lived. She just, in the moment of the moment, pay my rent, eat my food, get some wine, and I'm fine. And which is a tough way to live for 51 years. Eventually it caught up with her. She drank hard and she did a lot of drugs, and it was a fast life. But she truly did. She wasn't putting on airs. That's just how she chose to live. And I think Man Ray sensed that early on, like, this is a different kind of freedom that I will never attain. And because I have different wants and needs out of my life. And so I think it drove him crazy. And I think that's where a lot of the grit of this, the book's Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris, that rivalry, I think, is a key version of this so-called muse and artist relationship, where maybe we haven't seen as in depth in that idea of, like, it's really the fact that she drives him crazy, I think, is a spark, and why a lot of these images are still so alive 100 years later. Is there's something going on there. There's this dance between the two of them that I think it's hard to define, hard to capture, but I think it's there somewhere, of like really unsteady ground between the two of them in that little space where they're making these images. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I thought it was so brilliant how you made that point just now, and also in the book, that was part of her being a muse to him, was not just modeling for his photographs, but her spirit. It was so free, and he knew he could never be as free as her, that was part of her inspiration to him in that kind of rivalry sense, not just her talent, but also this freedom with which she lived her life. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Could we talk a little bit about Kiki's own work in that vein and how multi-talented? I mean, it's hard to keep track of all the things that she did. I think the umbrella that you use in the book that I think is absolutely right is this umbrella of storytelling. At the end of the day, she was a storyteller, whether it was through her paintings, whether it was through her songs or her biography, memoirs. So can you tell us a bit about Kiki as an artist and all these different arenas that she explored? And also, I'd love to hear if you have some favorite works of Kiki's, some favorite paintings of hers, I guess, are the most tangible things we can discuss.
Mm-hmm. She would start with this illustrating work very informally at the cafes, where she would just kind of draw people. And she made drawings of her childhood. And I think from an early age, she was sort of self-romanticizing and self-inventing in this visual form. And eventually in the 20s, she had some time. And I think this is a very key thing to remember, is that she had some free time and she had a little bit of stability because of what she had been earning as a singer and because of Man Ray's earnings. And Man Ray was away on a job in the south of France, and she had the summer to herself. And what she did with that summer, a lot of it was to paint. She finally, had this peace and quiet. And the paintings, I really like them. They're not for everyone. They're really like, I don't know. I find the colors really beautiful and the lines really simple and nice. There was a guy named Henri Pierre Rocher, who was a really well-regarded art dealer. He also wrote the book that became the movie Jules et Jim, the Truffaut movie, out of his memoirs of Montparnasse in the 20s. But he became a serious dealer. He sold some Picassos, he sold the Rousseau, and he had a great eye. And he legitimately bought Kiki's work and encouraged it and arranged gallery shows for her and said these are like Matisse's. He likened her to Matisse. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that I'm making the point in the book that she was this great painter who should be on the walls of MoMA, but I think there's something to the paintings that, I think she's putting something out there that was in the air at the time of experimenting with color and line. And also, as you said, the storytelling, that this idea of, here are my friends, here's my village, here are the people I love. There's a lot of love and joy in the paintings. There's one, I think it's just called Les Gitanes, which is like the gypsies of, a caravan of Roma people. And it's just this very pastoral scene, and you have the caravan people lying in the grass, and it's really great blues and yellows and greens. So that would be my favorite. I think there's some of them are reprinted in the book, and I think also just a bit of Googling, you should be able to find a few of them and make your own call. But yeah, that's where the visual side is. And then I guess if it's okay, the last, the thing I would also want to add is that as a writer, she has this little thin memoir that comes out in 30. She's like, it's like her autobiography. She's not even 30 years old when it comes out. And it really makes front page news in Paris because she's such a personality. And it's really sharp. She has some great lines about herself, about her upbringing, about her friends. And then when the English edition comes out the next year, also in Paris, and these are just small run things, Hemingway writes the introduction. And he's taking her very seriously. He's like bringing up Virginia Woolf and Daniel Defoe. And he only did that for one other writer in terms of writing an intro for this bartender in Montparnasse who also wrote a memoir. So I think he was into, like, maybe if you weren't a professional writer, he was a little bit more generous in giving the intros, but it wasn't something, he's not exactly like the most giving person when it came to those kinds of things. So quite remarkable. And the intro to Kiki memoirs is a fun little document to dig into too.
Yeah, thank you. I think he says something like, yes, you can translate the French to English, but you can't translate Kiki. So I think he even says in the English version introduction, like, you really should read this in French.
Yes, he totally dismisses the translator. He's like, this guy didn't really do a great job. But then on the other hand, it's pretty hard to do it because of who she is. So that was pretty funny to have the intro about to diss the book you're about to read, which is pretty funny.
Yeah, I know. I really love that. And I think it's interesting because the book comes out sort of just at the cusp of this big change in history and this big change in Kiki's life, where the 20s come to an end, the Great Depression starts, this world that is so colorful and so full of life and freedom starts to literally shut down before their eyes. And Kiki herself really struggles the rest of her life. She never again reaches that sense of, stardom and fame and celebrity. And as you said a little while back, she eventually succumbs to her alcoholism and drug use. And I think a lot of this, and this is one thing I wanted to ask for you to speak on, I think a lot of this also has to do, and you did mention this before as well, this divide between these two Kikis, this performative Kiki and this very shy, withdrawn Kiki. And I really sensed that in the end, it wasn't just this turn of the decade and this change in time. It was really that battle within her kind of brought her down as well. So One, could you talk about these two different sides of Kiki and how this contributed in the end to her downfall? And I guess you can also just speak to, just as all of her art is ephemeral, this time was also ephemeral, and how this time period didn't last very long. And with it, Kiki's own downfall followed.
So to start with Kiki herself, she does fit into that mold we've seen sometimes with performers, either in works of fiction or really, looking at lives of people who are public figures, of that idea of that divide and disconnect between the personal and the private. She was somebody that I think probably today we would say has really high social anxiety. She didn't love going to places where there were people she didn't know. And that's part of the reason she just was this Montparnasse fixture. She makes this joke of like in her book, my friends tried to drag me across the river to the right bank, but like, I'm a patriot. I stay where I know, and I'll never leave Montparnasse. And she really, she liked places that made her comfortable and friends that she knew and trusted. And yet at the same time, when she got on stage or in front of a camera, and we have this from her own letters and her own writing, she was hyper confident. But within a few years, she was too nervous to get on stage at the first time. It was an open mic kind of situation. Her friends sort of egged her on. She had to drink a lot. She got on stage and she sang, kind of blew everyone away. Not that her voice was so like amazing, but it's more about her presence. That's the other thing to remember. There are a few recordings of her that also people could dig up with a little bit of Googling. A couple of records she made in the 30s. But she said, like, I feel like the conductor of a train when I'm on stage. I can take people where I want them to go. I can draw them out. I look at them. I kind of make stories about them in my head. And I play off the energy that the crowd gives me, and then I give it back. And it's this really like iterative process that I think a lot of the great performers have, right? If you can sort of read the moment, read the crowd. So it's not like she's, nervous wreck on stage, but I think the idea at a certain point of fame, even if it's hyper local, and when it's tied to this idea of a persona, people want the persona, right? And so a lot of it, she said, struggled with men kind of groping her as she got off stage, or just assuming that she was sexually available because she put out that sort of femme fatale vamp personality on stage, and sort of having to physically fight that off, I think, was a struggle. And then, that idea of like, it gets to be a grind, right? She's starting to play all over town. She does eventually get to like Berlin to play. And for her, it was alcohol and I think cocaine. And that's tough to maintain as you age. And then that ties into the era. And that's really, the 20s are so interesting because like as a historian, you're taught that's the dumbest thing we do as humans is to like categorize, not the dumbest thing ever, but one of the silly things we do as humans is to categorize things in these decades as if it's like January 1st, 2010, the world changes, and then December 31st, 2019, it's totally different. But, we like dates and we need some sort of sense of order. But it so happens that in the 20s, it really is this perfect dovetailing of like the crash, Wall Street crash happens October 29. It doesn't hit France for a few years, but there is that shift of like, we've kind of run out of gas, right? Like you're dancing on the volcano's edge for so many years at such a pace because of the war, right? Because of the reaction. We survived this. We have survivor's guilt, or the people who didn't serve feel guilty, or whatever it is, or we did serve and now we're coming out of the trenches. 1 out of 4 people that we used to know is gone. Like all these things, all this pain, right, drives this huge energy and wildness and searching for meaning, for order, for disorder, whatever. Again, how long can that last? So that dovetailing with the idea of the financial crisis, then exposing a lot of the inherent weakness of the markets and finances in the 20s coming to the fore. And then with that comes a lot of dark stuff in the 30s, a lot of the simmering hatreds, a lot of the simmering problems nationally, internationally, creeping authoritarianism, all that stuff. So there is this story. It's really interesting. And so she does, it's not to say that like her life just ends. There's quite a few chapters that go beyond when she reaches, let's say, her cultural zenith in like 1930, we'll say 1929. But it's not all sad. It's just different. it's sad. Yes. Okay. That's not, but she finds this guy, André Larocque, who's a minor tax official. I mean, you know this because you read the book, but for the sake of the podcast. And he plays the accordion, and they hook up, and they start living together, and they perform in these little like restaurants. And like, yes, her moment has passed, but like she's still out there having fun. It's a very simple life. But Larocque, said that right before she died, she was the happiest he'd ever seen her. They just got back from like a weekend, and she was singing old songs, and she'd wrapped herself in his coat, and they were toasting to the first day of spring. So there was like, I think, some simple pleasures. But yeah, the end was tough. The end, I think that those last couple of days were tough on her physically, for sure.
I think you make a really good point. I think there's a quote, I don't have it with me here, but I did quote it at the end of our episode on Kiki, where, yes, on paper, it was sad because she was no longer as famous. The world had changed. She had gained a lot of weight. She was in the throes of alcoholism and drug use. But Kiki herself didn't find it sad. She enjoyed her life. As we were talking about, she was just in the present, and she enjoyed her life. She still had found ways to have fun. She found it very amusing that she was in all these paintings when she was younger, and was still very proud of all of that, all that she had done. So yeah, it's a good point. It wasn't sad to Kiki, and that is a very important point to make. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. Can you speak to the importance of sharing Kiki's story? Because your book is so important in getting Kiki's legacy out there. But why is it important that we know Kiki's story, and how can we change the way we look at Man Ray's photographs of her, or the many portraits of her? How can we see them through her eyes?
Yeah, I think important is a freighted word, and I try not to come to any of my projects with this idea of importance, or like this has to be out there, because then it can seep into the work in nefarious ways. I try to just be like, here's some lives that interest me. There's a question I want answered, and I don't know enough, and I'm going to dig around and see what I can find. And always it happens that once you start to look deeply in the past and think of people as fellow human beings, and try to get at their connections and their struggles, you always get a more complicated story than has been told. It can happen with anybody at any time. My book that's about to come out is about the writer Janet Flanner, who went as Janae in The New Yorker, and looking at her writing in the 20s and 30s. That's somebody who's not totally obscure, but certainly better known than when Kiki was. But again, once I started to look at her letters, her work, even, this totally new story came out. And so I guess the idea, if there's a sort of argument I'm trying to make implicitly, not explicitly, through these kinds of projects, is not that I'm trying to like rescue Kiki, or like say, although it does, through our conversation, there is that aspect. I'm not fighting that. And I think it's great to start to question and destabilize these ideas about artists and muses and all the rest, and to say, why is she being forgotten? Those are good questions to ask. But I think it's more about a bigger project of any footnote you see about somebody in a work of nonfiction. If you followed that footnote to its ultimate end point through all of the archival records, you would find an entire universe that is different from the one you know, and can be enlightening. And so that, I think, is the fun and the beauty of these kinds of projects, is just to follow those footnotes, go into the archives, find the old letters, and prepare to be kind of blown away. I think that's the beauty of the work.
Yeah, to go along on the journey.
Yeah,
the journey
exactly.
of their lives. Yeah, it's true. I find with ArtMuse, I will think of a painting and I'm like, was that person a real person? And then I'll start looking into them and I'm like, oh my God, not only were they real, but they lived this crazy life. Who knew?
Exactly right. I mean, you're doing the same work. I mean, it's exactly right. And the fun and the struggles of that kind of stuff. It can really change not just how you think about the project at hand, but about bigger questions about what we know and why, and who we know and why we think the way we do. I mean, that's really one of the joys of this kind of historical research.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, the footnotes have stories too. Well, thank you for sharing Kiki's story. I really did love this book. And I was telling you, I think for a biography, it's so beautifully written. It flows just like a novel. And it was such a joy to read and refer to in my research, and a book I will come back to and return to again. So I really thank you for being here today. I thank you for writing such a wonderful tribute to Kiki's life. And for all of those listening, I'm going to put the link to purchase your own copy of Kiki Man Ray in the show notes of this episode. I'm sure our listeners will absolutely love it, especially if you enjoyed our episodes on Kiki. So listeners will be able to purchase their own copy, and I know that you'll love it as much as I did. So thank you so much again, Mark. I really appreciate you being here.
Wow, that's so kind of you to say all that, and what a pleasure. And I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this special episode from our ArtMuse ArtTalks series, in which I interview the author Mark Braude. We have included a link to purchase Kiki Man Ray, Art, Love, and Rivalry in 1920s Paris in the show notes of this episode. Braude's biography is not only informative, but so beautifully written, and I cannot recommend it enough. We will be releasing more interviews this summer as part of our ArtMuse ArtTalks series as we prepare for Season 3. Season 3 of ArtMuse will return this fall. We cannot wait to continue to share these fruitful conversations with you. Until next time, bye for now.